Upstate New York, November 1957. In the sleepy town of Appalachian, an extraordinary meeting was taking place. Gathered in the garden of one of the town's wealthiest residents, a gang of sharp-dressed businessmen feasted on several hundred pounds of steak. This unusual group attracted attention, and the local cops looked on astonished. What they didn't know was that they were witnessing a summit meeting of the entire leadership of the American Mafia. In fact, until that moment, many denied the Mafia even existed. Sure, there was crime, but organized crime, a criminal gang with secret initiation rites and codes enforced by sentence of death, seemed like something out of the movies. Across the Atlantic in Sicily, things were much the same. Here, in the birthplace of the Mafia, its influence reached into every corner of life. Yet its very existence was often denied. Secrecy and internal discipline gave the Mafia its power, and this power was about to go global. 1957 marked the moment the American and Sicilian Mafias became international, forming a billion-dollar crime corporation. It was a turning point in another way, too. It signaled the start of a war against organized crime that would last almost half a century. A war that forced both the US and Italy, finally, to confront the terrifying criminal conspiracy in their midst. United States in the mid-1950s. The good times were here. The country had emerged from depression and World War with a booming economy. For many ordinary men and women, the American dream had become a reality. But something else was booming too: the Mafia. For those growing up in a family associated with the mob, it was as if the outside world barely existed, apart from being a source of easy money. The Mafia is organized in groups called families. The head of the family is known as the boss, or the godfather. And the longest-serving New York boss of all time was Joe Bonanno, known as Joe Bananas. He ran the Bonanno family from the early 1930s until the mid-1960s. Bonanno's power was founded on the influence he wielded over his community in New York. His son, Bill, saw firsthand how his father operated, and himself became a leading gangster with the Bonanno family.
My father would, on Tuesdays and Thursdays, would go into this hall and sit in an office in the back, and various people from the neighborhood would come in and ask favors. Somebody had a sick child and she couldn't pay the doctor, and my father would arrange for that. Somebody else had a husband who was cheating on her and she wanted to know what to do. He would take care of that. That happened twice a week. So when that happens, you begin to form the ideas that when you have a problem, you know where to go.
This is home movie footage, shot in Brooklyn in 1957. It looks like any ordinary American family, enjoying the new prosperity. But looks can be deceiving. Dominic Montilio was born into a mob family in New York. Some of his relatives were senior mobsters in the Gambino crime family, another of America's leading mafia families. Montilio was aware from an early age how his relatives were unlike others in the neighborhood.
I grew up in a very traditional mob family, and it was a very different kind of life than my other friends had. You know, I noticed that from the beginning, because there was times when Well, the FBI would break down the door because, I mean, we lived in the same house with my uncle, and he was very connected.
Montiglio's uncle was an up-and-coming gangster called Nino Gaggi. One day when he was 11, Dominic ran home, bursting to tell his uncle Nino that he had been elected class president at school.
I came home all excited because I had the button, it said president on it. And he said, oh, great. He says, what does the class president do? So I said, teacher goes out of the room and you watch the class. If anybody does anything wrong, you write their name on the board. And he looked at me and he says, you're telling me you're a rat, you're a stool pigeon. So I said, 10 years old, 11 years old, what are you going to say? And he said, well, tomorrow you got to go back and give that button back to the teacher and tell her you can't be the class president.
Il Bonanno and Dominic Montiglio both grew up in a world closed to the outside. The American Mafia called itself Cosa Nostra, our thing. But this was a world imported to America from several thousand miles away. This is where the Mafia came from. Sicily, the largest island in the Mediterranean, with a population of 5 million, less than 2 miles from the Italian mainland. Like Montiglio, Leoluco Orlando was born in 1947, in Palermo, Sicily's biggest city. Unlike Montiglio, he would grow up to fight the Mafia, not join it.
Sicily is a land of contradictions. Palermo is the capital of Sicily, is the capital of the Mafia too. Is the capital of the history, is the capital of the shame of this land.
In the Sicilian dialect, mafioso once meant bold or beautiful. From the 1860s, it became the name associated with the island's criminal element, who were often organized into families of men related by blood or marriage. But their existence was steeped in secrecy. Even discussing the Mafia was taboo, as Orlando found one day at school.
When I was 14 years old, 15 years old, I organized with other students a seminar about the Mafia and against the Mafia. The director, the Jesuit director of the school, called my parents and said, it is a scandal. Why Lucchetto is speaking about the Mafia? We have nothing to do with the Mafia, therefore we are not speaking about the Mafia. Gray area, not seeing, not speaking, not hearing. It was Sicily when I was a young student.
Joe Bonanno grew up in this world. He was a native Sicilian, born here in the pretty seaside town of Castellammare del Golfo in 1905. He only moved to America in the 1920s.
Sicily has a long history of mistrust of authority. There's an old saying back there that to know a man, you have to know his father, and his father before him, and his father before him. And once that happens, there is very little room for betrayal.
Much of the power of the Mafia derived from its ruthless discipline. Chief among these values was omertà, the vow of silence. In Sicily, all mafiosi had to take a sacred blood oath that they would never betray the organization to the authorities, and that they would always carry out the orders of their mob bosses. The novice was sworn in through a quasi-religious ceremony and became a so-called man of honor. The American Mafia followed exactly the same traditional initiation ceremony.
You're brought into a room and you're given the image of a saint. Prick your finger, enough to draw a drop or two of blood, put it on the image of the saint, put the saint in your hand, and they light it. And you take an oath, and it simply says that you hope to burn as this saint is burning if you betray your brothers.
To break this oath would mean death.
Our culture taught us to act like men. And acting like men meant keeping your mouth shut.
But for Bonanno and his fellow gangsters, omertà was more than just a vow of silence.
Omertà comes from the root manly, and it simply means to act like a man. And a man doesn't get somebody else into trouble. Therefore, he doesn't say, John did it. Who hit you in the face? John hit me in the face. A man will see to it that John gets hit in the face.
Just exactly what that meant is made clear by Dominic Montiglio. For his uncle Nino Gaggi, like other mafiosi of his generation, Sicilian traditions ran deep. His world was dominated by loyalty, secrecy, and vengeance. True to his roots, when Gaggi had his nose broken in a fight, he was determined to get his revenge, even if that meant waiting years. When the moment finally arrived, Gaggi took Montiglio and mobster Roy DeMeo with him to settle the score.
We parked a long block away from where this guy was, and he was hanging out with a bunch of people in front of a candy store, and we were waiting across the street, and I had a 22 with a silencer, and Nino and Roy both had 38s, and we waited for him to go to his car, and he was walking to his car. We started crossing the street, and then he made us, and he started to run, and we hit him right in the middle of the intersection.
Killings like this were a way of life in the Gambino crime family.
Oddly enough, it was my wife's birthday party. So we had left the party to go do this deed, and went back to her birthday party like nothing happened. You know, we opened the presents, had the cake, and that was the end of that.
Nino Gaggi was an old-fashioned gangster, a man to whom the traditional Sicilian values of the mafia meant everything.
You know, somebody were to break my nose, I might wait a little while, but my revenge would be maybe a broken nose and a little something else, a couple of fingers or something. But Nino, the old Sicilian school, you know, that's not good enough for them. You know, they have to make it 100-fold worse than what happened to them for them to be satisfied.
The values imported by Sicilian mafiosi to the United States were violent, secretive, and mistrustful of outsiders. In America, gangsters would take these traditional values and add go-getting entrepreneurial spirit to create a whole new kind of criminal organization. Early in the 20th century, a young man was growing up in Sicily who would change the face of crime. Salvatore Lucania, born in 1897, would become infamous as Charlie Lucky Luciano, the father of the modern American mafia. His hometown of La Cara Fridi was built on the hard and dangerous work of sulfur mining. Sulfur mines were primitive places where temperatures were so high, men would work naked. Yet these deprived laborers still had to pay the mafia for the right to work. They were not alone. The owner of the mine would have paid up too. The mafia squeezed money from all walks of Sicilian life. When he was 10, Luciano was one of hundreds of thousands of Sicilians who left the poverty of the islands behind and set sail for a new life in America. He soon drifted into crime. As a teenager, Luciano joined the notorious 5 Points gang, which also boasted Al Capone as a member. It was the age of prohibition. For 13 years, it was illegal to make or sell alcohol in the United States. Luciano and other bootleggers made millions supplying Americans with as much booze as they wanted. Salvatore Lucania started calling himself Charles Luciano. He gained the nickname Lucky and the scars on his neck when he miraculously survived a knife attack and beating. He presided over his criminal kingdom from a suite in New York's luxurious Waldorf Hotel. Here, he called himself Mr. Charles Ross. And he made it to the very top in 1932 with the killing of Salvatore Maranzano, then the most powerful boss in America. But the constant battles were getting in the way of business.
If there were 3 Italian mobsters in the Italian neighborhood, it was an almost certain guarantee that at least 2 of them were going to try to kill the third. And the third was plotting against the other 2. So bodies would wind up in the streets. To what purpose?
Luciano wanted the mafia families to bury their differences, not each other.
We can't make money with guns in our hand, was his expression, the expression that I heard over and over again. We can't make money with guns in our hand.
His solution was to set up a body called a commission, a mafia board of directors made up of the bosses of the 5 New York families, plus those of Chicago and Buffalo. Any boss with a grievance against another family could bring it to the commission. But for the plan to succeed, Luciano had to win the support of the other families, including Joe Bonanno, who had just taken over for Maranzano, the man whose killing Luciano had set up.
Because you got to remember, Luciano was an Americanized guy, so he talked that way. My dad always told me that Luciano talked just like those Americans. And he says, those guys are dead. I have no quarrel with you, and I know you don't have a quarrel with me. Therefore, past is the past, let's go on.
Joe Bonanno backed Luciano's plan and joined him on the first commission alongside Al Capone.
Luciano's conception was that he would meld Sicilian mafia mores, which formed a very tight organization with American business methods. That's basically what he came up with. A kind of amalgam that we came to know as American mafia organized crime.
With peace, the mob could concentrate on what it knew best, making millions of dollars from its control of illegal gambling, prostitution, and extortion. Small wonder life as a mobster seemed so attractive to many growing up in post-war America. The teenage Henry Hill watched awestruck from the window of his Brooklyn home at mafiosi gathered on the street.
You know, and you see those Cadillacs and, you know, and guys in suits, big black suits and diamond rings like the size of a quarter, you know, and beautiful woman. What the is this, you know? So I walked over, got a job, washing cars, sweeping them out, you know, just to hang out there. And that's how I, you know, started hanging out over there. And it was exciting, you know?
Hill would become a mobster with the Lucchese family. Another future gangster, Frank Culotta, was also in awe of the mobsters he saw as he was growing up in Chicago.
Well, actually, I grew up into that world. The neighborhood I came from, they were all outfit guys, crooks, murderers. And I sort of looked up to them and idolized them. I used to shine their shoes. They'd give me, instead of a nickel, they'd give me $1. So, I seen a lot of money then as a kid, and they impressed me. So in my mind, I always wanted to be something like that.
The ruthless discipline the commission brought to the world of crime meant the power of the mob grew unchecked. In New York, places like the waterfront became synonymous with mafia control. It used its control of the unions and fishing companies to make millions a year. It did the same across the city in industries such as construction, in which the Bonanno family was involved.
You construct a building, and you'd put in even just a 2 or 3 cent increase on the value of the cement that was used in that building, which could turn into millions of dollars.
every yard of concrete that got poured in the city, the Gambino family, the Genovese family, everybody got a piece of that yard of concrete, just through the unions.
It wasn't just one little thing, but you multiply this by hundreds and hundreds and thousands of activities that were going on throughout the country, and you got a force to be reckoned with.
In New York, the Mafia seemed to have its finger in every pie.
We ran the city, basically. I mean, we could stop a building from going up, or a movie being made, a show on Broadway. You know, I mean, you didn't do the right. You didn't do what the boss wanted you to do. You were either dead, or you were out of business. It wasn't pretty.
For the most part, the authorities denied the existence of a national criminal organization. One reason was that the Mafia was busy buying protection for itself. Bill Bonanno says he would meet corrupt police officers in a restaurant to give them their bribes.
I had dinner at a little restaurant. I was there with two other friends. And we were sitting around, and they said, "You have a look of nostalgia in your face. What's up?" I said, "You know, I used to come here in the late 40s and early 50s, and I turned around and I said, I used to sit in that corner back there. And I used to meet with a captain and two lieutenants from law enforcement. And one of them said, "Well, what were you doing here?" I said, "We were giving them their envelopes." Envelopes for what? To look the other way while we had the gambling, we had the horse racing, the bookmaking, and the numbers.
The commission was presiding over a boom time. As he rose through the ranks of the mob, Bill Bonanno attended several meetings of the commission with his father, Mafia boss Joe Bonanno. The commission boasted it was so powerful that it could even influence government.
I can remember a time, and I participated in some of those meetings, and the decisions that had to be made were, you're going to be the next federal judge. You're going to be the next governor. You're going to be the next senator. You're going to be the next House of Representatives candidate. The men got up after those decisions, and lo and behold, it happened.
The Mafia had a power that was unacknowledged and unchallenged, until the temptation to make even more money proved impossible to resist, and finally forced the US government to act. In the United States and Italy in the 1950s, the Mafia controlled many aspects of life. Yet the governments in both countries barely acknowledged the existence of organized crime. Law enforcement had a different enemy. The Cold War was at its height. The main target of the FBI were American communists, not Italian-American gangsters.
The communist bloc has woven a vast network of espionage throughout the free world.
The communist line is uniform and deadly. Destroy America.
After World War II, in the FBI's New York office, there were 400 agents chasing communists. There were just 5 dealing with organized crime. The story was similar at the Department of Justice, where William Hundley worked.
When I took over the organized crime section in the Justice Department in 87, there were basically, maybe 7 or 8 lawyers there who were basically clipping newspapers. They weren't doing anything either.
The director of the FBI was J. Edgar Hoover. He had been its head for over 30 years. Hoover was one of the most powerful men in Washington, eventually serving under 8 presidents. In law enforcement, what Hoover said went. And to Hoover, America's priority was the Red Menace. Hoover had almost no Italian-American agents who could infiltrate the mob. Indeed, he had few agents from any ethnic minority.
At that time, Hoover did not have one black agent. He had no female agents. Excuse me, his chauffeur was black, so he made his chauffeur an agent, so he could say he had one black agent. In essence, he had all of these waspy guys, you know, with the snap hats on and whatnot. Yeah.
But from the late 1950s, a succession of events would change all that, finally forcing the authorities and the nation to acknowledge the existence of the Mafia. Once again, it all started in Sicily. And it was a story in which Mafia godfather Joe Bonanno played a central role. In late 1957, Bonanno took a trip back to his native Sicily. He had been born here in the tiny coastal town of Castellammare del Golfo before emigrating to the US as a youngster. But Bonanno's trip was no sentimental journey. The Mafia Don was on business. Joe Bonanno had maintained close links with his family and criminal associates in the old country. He was approached by some old acquaintances for advice on a pressing problem.
My dad told me that one of the leaders of the Palermo Mafia came to him and said that there's a few people that they would like to talk to him about certain problems that they're having here in Sicily.
A meeting took place in this building, the Grand Hotel de Palme in Palermo, one of the top hotels in the Sicilian capital. Even to this day, details of who attended and what was discussed remain shrouded in mystery. Bonanno may not have been the only American present. Charles Lucky Luciano was now living in Italy, having been deported from the US after the war. Today, the Italian authorities believe that he was also present at the Hotel de Palme.
E dal 12 al 16 ottobre del 57 a Palermo.
From the 10th to the 16th of October 1957 in Palermo, in the Hotel de Palme, there was a summit of about 30 mafia bosses. American Cosa Nostra and Sicilian mafia bosses.
Cioè era presente per esempio la famiglia Bonanno con il suo capo Joe Bonanno.
The major American families were represented: Joe Bonanno, Lucky Luciano, who had been in Italy since 1947, and then there were the local mafia heads.
Era presente Lucky Luciano, che era già in Italia dal 1947, e poi erano presenti i capi mafia locali, i capi mafia siciliani.
Over dinner, the Sicilians explained why they wanted the meeting. This was a business convention, and high on the agenda was the subject of drugs, which offered vast profit, but at a price.
The purpose of the meeting was to pick my father's brains as to how they were going to resolve a problem they were beginning to have among each other over the narcotics trade in Turkey.
The Sicilians faced a dilemma.
Various families within the Mafia were at odds as to whether they should or they shouldn't get themselves involved with this, and the younger element saw nothing wrong in making a profit.
In fact, the American Mafia was having the same debate about drugs. It seems that Joe Bonanno wasn't just offering friendly advice. He was there to close a deal that would reorganize the global trade in heroin. According to the FBI, it was this meeting which established the Bonanno family as the main players in the transatlantic heroin trade. The Sicilians would manufacture and smuggle the drug into the US. The Americans would distribute it and take a cut. This was the first time the mafias on both sides of the Atlantic had come together on such a scale. An early example of globalization, but run by organized crime.
Di Sicilian Connection si parla in epoca più tardi.
The foundations were laid for collaboration between Sicilian Mafia, which wasn't yet called Cosa Nostra, and the American Cosa Nostra, which had as its main objective heroin trafficking.
Bill Bonanno says the organization of the Mafia itself was also on the agenda, and that his father advised the Sicilians to copy Luciano's recipe for resolving disputes.
It was at that meeting that he suggested that one of the ways that they might resolve their problem and have a little better handle on the situation is to do what the Americans had done, and that was to form a commission.
The Sicilians did set up a commission, but it would only meet a few times and never gained the authority of the American original. In America, the subject of drugs continued to dominate Mafia discussions.
The new organization that Luciano created solved just about every problem you could think of, except one: narcotics. In the beginning, Luciano assumed that the organization could keep organized crime out of narcotics altogether. It simply wasn't worth the trouble. The difficulty was the money.
And for the Mafia, money was always irresistible. The Americans arranged a summit to ratify the deal with their Sicilian cousins, a meeting that would provide one of the most infamous moments of their history. The deal between the Sicilian and American Mafia in late 1957 was a turning point for both organizations. The money offered by the drug business was the key. Everyone knew that drug dealing was a far bigger dollar earner than other activities like illegal gambling and extortion. But it also brought with it long prison sentences, and mob bosses feared that their men would break the code of silence if they faced decades in prison.
There was friction among the various families. Some of the younger people, especially those in New York and in Boston and in Chicago, thought that this was the great new thing coming. Speaking strictly about money.
The Mafia in Chicago, known as the Outfit, claimed the hardest anti-drugs line. Frank Carlotta was a rising young gangster there.
At the time I was there was no drugs allowed to be sold, or you couldn't deal with drugs at all, or else you get whacked. Because we always knew that if you dealt with drugs, it was a dirty business, and it'd be like you're feeding your own kid narcotics. So it was like taboo, and if you got involved with it, you're definitely going to get whacked.
The Mafia families called a summit in November 1957, just 1 month after the meeting with the Sicilians in Palermo. Joe Bonanno was to be joined at the summit by another godfather, Vito Genovese. Both men wanted the mob to deal in drugs.
Chief among Genovese's agenda items was narcotics. He was directly involved in narcotics. Bonanno was deeply involved in narcotics. A lot of the other bosses were on the sly involved in narcotics. And he argued, look, it's a fact of life anyway. Who are we kidding? Let's make it official. Let's really make money out of this thing.
The summit was held in a small town called Appalachian in upstate New York. The venue was a large house on a 58-acre estate owned by Joseph Barbera, a wealthy businessman and Mafia associate. It was chosen because its isolated rural location seemed safe from the prying eyes of the law. Unfortunately for the mob bosses, they got that 100% wrong. For over a year, the local state police had been watching the place after they discovered that a house guest was a leading New York mobster, Carmine Galante, Joe Bonanno's underboss. On the 14th of November, officers were surprised to observe several Cadillacs with out-of-state plates. When the state troopers went to take a closer look, they saw about 100 men enjoying a barbecue, all of them wearing dark suits, fedoras, and shiny shoes.
If you didn't know that it was a mafia summit, and you suddenly were dropped from a spaceship into the middle of this thing, you would think it's just some kind of friendly barbecue among a lot of friends who, oddly enough, seem to be wearing suits to a barbecue, but you know, each to his own taste.
Suddenly, someone spotted the police.
These are men that if you, like Pavlov's dogs, if you say, it's the cops, there's one instinct. That's to run. That's exactly what they did.
Pandemonium broke out. Some bosses hid, some took to their cars, others fled into the woods.
It was a farce. It was probably the mafia's lowest moment. The idea of all these big-time bosses running through the thickets in their sharkskin suits and their silk ties and their $500 Italian shoes. It was unbelievable.
Joe Bonanno escaped the chaos, but only because he was late.
They were coming there. When they got to the bottom of the hill, you could see all the way up the hill, and they could see these police cars and the barricades in front of the street, so they just kept on driving and went back to New York City.
Around 60 mobsters were detained, identified, and questioned. But there was little the authorities could do. Attending a barbecue was not a crime, and they were not even carrying guns. While the mobsters went free, they were convicted by the media. The next day, the Gangland Conference was headline news across America. Appalachian had finally provided proof of the existence and scale of the mafia.
J. Edgar Hoover, who was head of the FBI, said there is no such thing as the mafia. There is no such thing as the National Crime Organization. There is no such thing as a leadership group within this organization. Well, even he had to admit after this meeting that maybe there was something.
The extent of organized crime in the United States is a national disgrace. The very fact that we have a crime problem reflects an evil of even greater import.
It generated a lot of pressure to get something done. In my own situation, I mean, that's why I was appointed head of the organized crime section.
Now law enforcement would have to play catch-up to come to terms with organized crime.
One of my biggest complaints was that, we wanted to pool information on these people. We wanted the investigative agencies to share it. We wanted to collect it on the mafia leaders and whatnot to make our efforts to prosecute them much more feasible. Couldn't get it done. They just wouldn't do it. First of all, they didn't have anything, and second of all, they wouldn't share what they didn't have,
The spotlight was now on the mafia. Before long, they would attract the attention of the president and the American public alike. In 1960, the United States went to the polls to choose a new president. It was the most hotly contested election for years. John Kennedy and his rival Richard Nixon were neck and neck in the polls. The contest was too close to call. Both candidates made every effort to get the voters out.
We are aiming our whole campaign toward the unregistered voting, to try to get those citizens who are not registered to vote, who are not even eligible to vote in this election, to get them on the books so that they can vote in November. This is a crucial area as far as Senator Kennedy is concerned.
The American mafia had influenced local politics for decades. Now seasoned gangsters suddenly got community spirit on a national stage. Chicago gangster Frank Alotta says he was told by his boss to get involved in the election.
Came around and told all us guys to reach out to all the Italian people and Polish people that they had this Irishman, Kennedy, that was running against Nixon. And we needed to get him in office. We needed all the votes we could get to get this guy in office.
It seemed the Mafia wanted Kennedy in the Oval Office. What has never been clear is why, despite allegations of links between JFK's father, Joe Kennedy, and organized crime. Kennedy squeaked by, beating Nixon by just over 100,000 votes across the country. In Illinois, the Democrats won by just 9,000 votes.
The election may have been a close one, but I think that there is general agreement by all of our citizens that a supreme national effort will be needed in the years ahead to move this country safely through the 1960s.
If the Mafia hoped that a Kennedy administration would be easy on organized crime, the new president turned out to be a major disappointment. His younger brother Robert became Attorney General. He had already proved to be a ferocious opponent of organized crime, from his time as counsel to the Senate Labor Rackets Committee. His appointment had an immediate impact on the FBI and its director, J. Edgar Hoover.
That's when Hoover started having his agents put in the bugs, the listening devices and whatnot, because he knew that Kennedy was going to press him very hard on organized crime.
The FBI bugged two main centers of mob activity in the US, Chicago and Las Vegas, where the lucrative gambling rackets were run by the Chicago mob, known as the Outfit. It was illegal to listen to private conversations, even those of suspected gangsters, but it went a long way to convincing many in the agency that the mob posed a very real threat.
These devices, of course, were illegal because they involved breaking and entering and whatnot. But the information that the FBI picked up on those devices, they might not have convinced Hoover, but they certainly convinced the FBI as an institution that there was a mafia.
Attorney General Robert Kennedy paints a grim picture of the rise of lawlessness under the Cosa Nostra, or Mafia.
This was not what the mob had expected. Some mafiosi claimed that a deal had been made and broken.
I was amazed that Robert Kennedy went after organized crime so hard, because it went against everything that Robert Kennedy's father had agreed to for the help and support of getting Jack elected to the presidency.
The American government was taking a more aggressive line, but they had failed to penetrate the mob. Part of the Mafia's power was based on its code of silence, known as omertà. Then the FBI got a break. It was a story that had its roots in the Mafia's continuing indecision as to whether to get involved in the heroin trade. Joe Valachi was a mobster with the Genovese crime family, a 30-year veteran of organized crime.
Valachi had a sixth grade education. I think he committed his first crime when he was about 6 or 7 years old. Broke into a grocery store, in and out of jail. But he had, he had street smarts.
Joe Valachi was a low-scale, knuckle-dragging hood who was never going to be any more than a soldier. He was never going to make the really big money.
In 1962, he was in Atlanta jail serving a prison sentence for drug dealing. He feared that his bosses were going to kill him there, for officially, the mob was still opposed to drugs. Valachi acted first, murdering an inmate he believed had been ordered to kill him. It was the wrong man. Whether through fear or remorse, Valachi broke and decided to turn government witness.
Now, the original idea was that he would become an informant for the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and tell them about other dope dealers. That's all the Bureau wanted to know. Other dope dealers, that's their job. But Robert Kennedy had a brighter idea. He said, wait a minute, let's talk to him about the Mafia.
It was the first crack in the Mafia's code of silence. William Hungley was one of the first to hear his revelations.
As soon as we got the story, I mean, we moved him up to Fort Dix, flew him up there in a helicopter. The brig up there was empty, and we put him in the brig. We started interviewing him.
Valachi detailed the structure of the mafia families, from his level as a soldier to the very top, the Godfathers. But this information was never given by him in any criminal trials. Instead, Robert Kennedy turned to television, which was covering the sessions of the McClellan Committee.
Bobby Kennedy had the brilliant idea, let's put Joe Valachi on show. Joe Valachi gets before the Senate Committee, and a national audience is absolutely fascinated.
The nation's underworld gets the unwelcome spotlight of publicity as the Senate's Investigations Subcommittee begins new hearings on crime. Arkansas Senator McClellan is at the helm.
William Hungley was present as Valachi's electrifying testimony was broadcast across the nation.
He really didn't want to cooperate. There's no doubt about that. Quite frankly, though, when he got in front of those Kliegelites up before the McClellan Committee, he, the adrenaline started to flow, and I think he, in a sort of a perverse way, that he kind of enjoyed it.
Why did you decide to kill him at that time, at that spot?
Because he's the guy I spotted at that time.
In
other words, I felt that was my last day, in plain English, Senator. I felt that was my last day.
In other words, this was a defense for you. You thought that if you killed this man who you thought was going to kill you anyway, that this...
I got some satisfaction, Senator. Put it that way.
You got some satisfaction.
Valachi's testimony caused a sensation. Here, live on TV, was a mobster giving the first tantalizing glimpse into the secret world of the mafia, or, as he called it, Cosa Nostra, Italian for our thing. Valachi corroborated what the FBI bugs had begun to pick up, and what its director, J. Edgar Hoover, had reluctantly started to believe. That a modern American criminal group used rituals and symbols from Sicily to maintain internal discipline and run its multi-million-dollar enterprise.
While you were repeating the words, you were burning the paper.
Right, this is the way I burn if I expose this organization.
There's always a lot of skepticism about that, because nobody had ever come forward and, said how you get made and whatnot. And apparently, it was exactly the way he said it was. They decide who's going to get made, you get together, you burn this holy picture and whatnot, and then bingo, you're a made member of the mafia.
He went on to explain that you lived by the gun and by the knife, and you died by the gun and by the knife.
Who was chosen? Who became your godfather?
Joe Bonanno.
Joe Bonanno?
It happened to be
now,
my
where
godfather.
is he? Is he on this chart we have here? Is he at the head of one of the families now?
Yeah, he still is.
He still is?
Yes.
Still alive?
Right.
For the American Mafia, and the Bonanno family in particular, Valachi's TV appearances were devastating.
Valachi's testimony was certainly a blow to the people in our world. There's no question about that.
Senator, can I say something, Senator?
Yeah.
As to what I'm telling you now, I need to go no further to say nothing else. This is what I'm telling you, what I'm exposing to you and the press and everybody. This is my doom.
Joe Valachi died in prison of cancer in 1971. He had helped shatter the view that there was no national criminal organization in the United States. Cosa Nostra could no longer act in secret at a time when they were moving more and more onto the international stage with their Sicilian cousins. For both mafias, once broken, omertà, the vow of silence, could never be as strong again. In the 1960s, the history of the Mafia changed forever when the Sicilian mob began flooding the United States with an illicit and lethal narcotic: heroin. Heroin would turn the Mafia into a global organization and make them more money than they had ever made before. But it would also sow the seeds of their own destruction. A battle would rage on the streets between a new breed of ruthless mafioso and a new kind of policeman prepared to risk everything to infiltrate the Mafia for the first time. This was a war over billions of dollars, millions of lives, and the future of America itself. In the late 1960s, drug addiction in the American cities was on the increase, and crime was rising. The government was forced to take action. In 1971, President Nixon declared war on drugs. Just a year later, law enforcement won a major battle by breaking up the Marseille-based heroin racket known as the French Connection. These French laboratories were supplying America with so much of the drug that the bust led to a heroin famine on the streets. What nobody knew was that this success would lead to disaster. Shutting down the French Connection was indirectly opening the door to something every bit as dangerous: the Sicilian Mafia. In the coming years, they would fill the gap in the market and forge a relationship with the most feared mafioso in America, Carmine Galante. In 1974, 2 years after the French Connection was busted, Carmine Galante walked out of prison, ready to flood America with a new source of heroin and turn the Mafia into a global drugs corporation. Galante was a member of the Mafia family known as the Bonanos. He had a long history of drug trafficking and an even longer history as a tough guy. His personality could be summed up by an incident at Lewisburg Prison, where he was serving a sentence for drugs trafficking.
During telephone days, when inmates line up to use the telephone, he was in a section which had some of the toughest black inmates you've ever seen. Murderers, strong-arm artists, you name it. And he would simply walk to the head of the line, grab the phone out of some black inmate's hand and said, "Get off the phone." This surrounded by 200 black guys. No one dared touch a hair on his head.
When he got out of prison, the rumblings that you heard on the street was a lot of people were scared of him. And he was a real tough guy, little office rocker, and always known as a heroin man. That's what he did.
When Galante got out of prison, the Bonanos were in crisis, their leadership either exiled or in prison. Joe Bonanno's son, Bill, is a convicted mobster. He remembers Galante only too well.
He had a short fuse. He was abrasive. He had a manner about him that he would never win any popularity contest, and constantly had a cigar in his mouth. And that's where he got his nickname, the Cigar.
With no challengers prepared to take on this dangerous man, the Bonanos had their new boss. Galante's top priority was to kickstart the heroin trade. In 5 short years, he transformed the fortunes of the US Mafia by leading it into an era of multi-billion-dollar profits and unparalleled violence.
In the 70s, the Bonanno family was known in the mafia circles basically as being the heroin family. I mean, you know, everybody knew they were dealing in heroin.
Galante was now in the perfect position to build a heroin business even bigger than the French connection. He was head of the Bonanno family, and now the heroin trade was moving to Sicily, where Galante had his roots. Galante was born in New York, but his family came from the town of Castellammare del Golfo in the northwest of Sicily. Sicilians had been emigrating to America for 100 years, but many of their descendants kept strong links with their homeland. Galante was no exception. His plan was to exploit his close ties with the Sicilian Mafia to dominate the American heroin trade. This was the beginning of a whole new era in the history of the Mafia. Until now, the Sicilian and American Mafia had mainly operated as separate organizations. With the French connection broken, the Sicilian Mafia decided to fill the gap in the market, and there was no bigger market than America. The Sicilians set up a sophisticated smuggling system. Pakistani suppliers shipped partially refined opium from Asia via Turkey to a rendezvous point off the coast of Sicily. A transmitter on the seabed alerted the Sicilians when the drug ships had arrived. Then a powerboat would speed out to meet it, returning with the drugs under cover of darkness. The opium base was processed into heroin in laboratories on the west of the island. 3 Sicilian bosses ran this growing trade, but one of them was far more ambitious, far more greedy, and far more dangerous than the others. Totò Riina. Riina planned to shake up the Sicilian Mafia, just as Galante was making waves in America. The Sicilian Mafia always claimed they adhered to a code of honor, murdering only when necessary, and avoiding the killing of innocents, women and children. But Riina shunned these old guard rules.
Dottor Riina è stato sempre un personaggio molto rumoroso, molto rumoroso.
Totò Riina had always been a loud person, very, very noisy.
Ha fondato il suo potere sul terrore.
He was an extremely violent person and someone who had founded his empire by terror.
E ad ammazzare dico anche gli amici quando diventavano dico un poco.
He never gave a second thought to killing his adversaries or killing his friends when they became slightly less friends.
L'assassino dico di bambini, cioè da questo punto di vista.
He had no hesitation in ordering the killing of children.
Con feroce determinazione da parte di Riina è stata proprio quella.
Riina relentlessly carried out a strategy of terror against his enemies and the state.
Riina was as ambitious as he was ruthless. He was determined to become the boss of bosses, head of the Sicilian Mafia. To achieve this, he would commit so many atrocities that he became known simply as the Beast. Totò Riina, known as the Beast, was putting Sicily on the heroin map. In the early 70s, his factories were producing ton after ton of pure heroin. All of it needed to be sold. On the other side of the Atlantic, Carmine Galante and the American Mafia could see that there were huge sums to be made selling Sicilian heroin. But there was also a problem. Throughout its history, the US Mafia had vowed never to be associated with drugs. The Chicago mob known as the Outfit, was one of the most vocal opponents of the drugs trade.
We always knew that if you dealt with drugs, it was a dirty business. And it'd be like you're feeding your own kid narcotics. So it was like taboo. And if you got involved with it, you're definitely going to get whacked.
As far as the Outfit was concerned, there was no need to deal drugs when money could be made in more acceptable ways. In the 1970s, Frank Carlotta was sent to Las Vegas to make sure nobody messed with the Outfit's highly profitable casinos.
My main job was the casinos, to make sure that everything ran smooth in there, there was no stealing going on, that they knew that our presence was there, that if they did mess around, that they would get hit in the head.
For Carlotta and his crew, running casinos earned them respect in a way drugs never would.
Actually, it was great. It was beautiful. I mean, you had everything you needed out there. You had anything you wanted to do. You had movie stars. They wanted to be involved with you. You wanted to be involved with them. Anywhere you went, you got the red carpet treatment. It was like you were respected. I think you were respected. I'm hoping that I wasn't feared, but in some cases you were feared. And if that brought respect, well, then it brought respect.
But for others, the huge profits of heroin dealing were hard to resist. From his beginnings in suburban Brooklyn, Dominic Montilio grew up to be a member of the notorious New York crime family, the Gambinos. He dealt drugs for the Mafia for many years.
The word that filtered down, just saying, you know, if you got caught, you know, dealing drugs, you know, it was an immediate death sentence. But the real message that came down was just don't get caught. At that time, I couldn't think of one crew that I knew that wasn't involved in it, because the money was too lucrative to pass up. The street crews that were involved in it weren't going to give it up either which way. You know, there was guys that weren't making a real good living that all of a sudden were taking, you know, 150 large a week down.
The mob didn't want to be seen to be peddling drugs, but they were happy to take the money.
I mean, the reason, there was no great moral reasons why they didn't want you dealing in heroin. It was just that it would bring that much more heat on the family. But the bottom line is the cash, you know, and that's cash business. And the amounts are staggering, the amounts of money that can be made.
The New York families knew that dealing drugs would attract attention from the authorities, but it was a risk they were prepared to take. The US Mafia secretly embraced the heroin trade and was soon making more money than they knew what to do with.
The unpleasant fact is that there is a new epidemic of heroin use in the United States.
As Sicilian heroin began to flow, addiction rates in America soared. At the end of World War II, America had an estimated 20,000 heroin users. By the mid-70s, there were more than 500,000. The FBI had little idea how such large quantities of drugs were getting into the country, or who was bringing it in. But that was about to change. In the 50s and 60s, FBI agents were mostly white males. Now the FBI was recruiting from a much wider pool. Finally, they had young, ambitious agents who came from the communities that were home to the Mafia and could speak the Sicilian dialect. One such man was Joe Pistone, better known as Donnie Brasco. What he was about to attempt would transform the FBI's fight against organized crime. Joe Pistone was a young FBI agent from a Sicilian background. His mission was to infiltrate the Mafia, something that had never been done before.
I grew up in New Jersey, and I grew up in an Italian neighborhood. And in this neighborhood, there were mafia guys, mob guys, and I I went to high school with sons of mob guys, so I knew about the mafia growing up. It wasn't foreign to me when I became an FBI agent, so I was pretty well versed in the ways and traditions of the mafia.
Joe Pistone's dream was always to be a cop.
Growing up, it was easy. It would have been easy to go, to go crooked or become bent because you're in the neighborhood, you see what's going on. There are guys doing illegal activities, but I never had an inkling to go toward that because of my parents. I mean, I know if I ever did anything wrong that I get a good swift boot in the rear end from my father.
On July the 7th, 1969, Pistone was sworn in as a special agent of the FBI. 7 years later, he disappeared from everyday life and developed a new identity.
Everybody needs a legend, and that's a history, a legend, a history. And so, you pick a name, and I picked Donnie Brasco, and I picked a jewel thief, burglar, jewel thief, because it's a profession that is not involved in violence. Not many jewel thieves are in jail for murder. So you want a legend that is a non-violent legend, and you want one where you can provide somebody with something. So I could come around with precious gems, jewels, and tell them that I had just pulled a score.
Pistone's job was to work his way into a mafia family. The risks were great, but if he pulled it off, he had the chance to expose a secret world of crime. One wrong move, and he faced almost certain death.
In order to do this job, undercover work, you have to have two things. You got to have a lot of nerve, and you got to have a lot of mental toughness. I'm not a person that sweats, When I get into a jam, I don't sweat, so you don't know if you're scaring me or not, And, there's not much that can be done to you. The worst thing that can happen is they can kill you. That's about it.
The FBI wanted the inside story on the mafia. The Bonanno boss, Carmine Galante, was their first target. Pistone used the FBI's diamonds and his Sicilian roots to gradually infiltrate Galante's mafia family.
Being of Italian ancestry and knowing the streets and knowing how the mafia operates, you speak when you're spoken to. You mind your own business. You don't get involved in conversations that don't concern you. They don't just embrace you and take you in, and you have to just lay back, be patient, and work your way. And it's the first impression that's gonna carry you through. And if you do certain things that they pick you out, that you have street smarts and you aren't a street guy, that's what's gonna make you.
The fuzzle was right on the table. It's ready to...
In March 1977, Pistone began to hang around in known Bonanno territory. He soon got noticed by mafia foot soldiers. One of the wise guys Pistone met was Lefty Ruggiero. Pistone would later discover that Lefty was a known hitman for the mob. Lefty approached Pistone, asking him to sell some stolen jewelry.
I was introduced to a fellow by the name of Lefty Ruggiero, and Lefty was a 24-hour gangster. I mean, he knew the mob, he knew everything about the mafia. If you need a teacher in the mafia, Lefty was the guy that you wanted. I used my street smarts and my knowledge of the mafia, and I didn't push with him as far as questions and trying to get the information. And he liked that. He saw that I was a street guy, that I knew the streets, and also being a jewel thief and bringing around some precious stones. He liked that too, because it was money,
As his undercover operation stretched into months and years, Pistone gradually became an accepted face within the mob. but the risks remained high. Former gangster Henry Hill knows all about the dangers that Pistone faced.
I mean, he was susceptible to get figured out at any time, you know. I mean, it took balls. Believe me, it took balls. But he also enjoyed it. You know, he became a member, or as close as you can come as a member.
Pistone's cover story was tested to the limit one night when he was taken to a mob hangout and interrogated by two mafia soldiers.
I didn't get along with these guys. They don't, you know, personalities clashed or whatever. The one guy says, look, we're not too convinced that you say you are who you are, you know, a jewel thief, a burglar. And if you don't convince us, you know, you're not going to leave here alive. So we were in there for maybe 5.5, 6 hours, you know, me trying to convince them that I was really Donnie Brasco. I gave them a phone number of a guy in Miami that was supposed to vouch for me, or just vouch for Donnie Brasco. That's all he knew. So one of them went out. He came back about a half hour later, and he said, okay, you're all right.
Pistone was so convincing, an almost father and son relationship developed between him and Lefty.
He did have an affection for me, I think, because he saw me, you know, something that he might have wanted to have been, or his son, you know, to have been. And he introduced me to his family and his wife, and I spent a lot of times at his house having dinner. So it became more than just a, you know, gangster on gangster relationship.
By the summer of 1977, Pistone had won Lefty's trust. But would he ever get any closer to heroin boss Carmine Galante?
I was with Lefty one night, and he said we gotta go somewhere, and I said, well, where we're going? And he said, well, I'll tell you when we get there. Galante was having a meeting in there, and it was our job to stand outside and make sure that the meeting went smooth and nothing happened. Basically, we were outside guarding them.
This was a big opportunity for Pistone.
And I asked him, I said, you know, Left, can't we go inside? And he says, what are you, crazy? You can't go in there and sit down when the boss is meeting. You can't even meet the boss. You know, he doesn't meet anybody on your level. He says, we got to stand out here until we're told, till they release us, till we're told we can go. You know, it was kind of an adrenaline rush. A lot of things go through your mind, but the main thing was that if I get killed, I'm going to get killed as a wise guy, not as an FBI agent here. You know, here I'm an FBI agent working undercover, and you know, nobody ever got to be close to a boss, let alone guard him.
Pistone did not get as close to Galante as he wanted, but he learned important facts about his operation. Before Pistone went undercover, the FBI had some idea about the inner workings of the mob. Now, for the first time, an agent was able to confirm the way the Mafia was organized from the inside. Pistone told the FBI how each family was structured into a military formation. At the top was the head of the family. Working directly for him was an underboss and an advisor, known as a consigliere. Beneath them were the capos, each of whom ran a crew of 5 to 10 foot soldiers. This structure meant the boss was always several layers away from the foot soldiers and the crimes they committed, making it almost impossible to convict the head of the family. This was vital intelligence in the war against the mob, but it was just the beginning. Pistone also managed to find out the secret of Galante's meteoric rise within the New York Mafia.
Joe came back to us telling us about Sicilians whom the American mafia figures were referring to as zips. And to him, this meant that these Sicilian mafia figures within the Bonanno family were actually being used to commit murder, dealing in drugs, heroin, That was a just unbelievable revelation.
I met some Sicilian that were members of the mafia, and these guys were made guys over in Sicily and then brought over here. But the Sicilians had their own clique over here in the U.S.
Galante had imported his own private army of ruthless Sicilian mafiosi.
Galante's two key guys that he brought over were Caesar Bonaventure and Baldo Amato. He brought them over from Sicily, and they were with him constantly. And I think one of the reasons why he did bring them over is that he felt a better sense of security with the Sicilians, because I guess he felt they were still loyal to the tradition. They weren't Americanized yet.
Galante's new bodyguards made waves in the Bonanno family.
There was a lot of friction, I found, between the American mafia and the Sicilians, even though they were married up into one family. I mean, anyway, Lefty and Sonny and the other Americans thought that they were looking to take over the family, and that the other American mafia guys didn't trust them and didn't like them.
The Sicilian and American mafia were cut from very different cloth. In the past, the Sicilians had embraced rules and traditions, but that was changing.
They'd kill anyone, where we had certain rules. It sounds strange, but there were rules as to, who you had to get permission from to go do a piece of work, or you couldn't kill a guy in front of his family, and they didn't have those rules.
These new ruthless Sicilians were from a mafia clan based in Corleone, a remote rural town deep in the mountains of Sicily.
Corleone mafiosi are made of different stuff. They're tough, very hard. Probably their peasant lifestyle trained them to withstand anything thrown at them. Jail doesn't scare the Corleonesi. They aren't frightened of death. They're always faithful to their boss.
The Corleonesi had reached the top of the Sicilian mafia by breaking rules and killing without permission from anyone. In the American mafia, obedience to your superiors was deeply ingrained. The godfather of the American mafia, Charlie Lucky Luciano, had formed an organization known as the Commission back in 1931. This was like the board of directors of the mafia. All the heads of the families would meet to settle disputes and decide on strategy. The Commission imposed discipline on the warring families. Rules were agreed, which changed little over decades. One of the rules was that you didn't kill someone without permission from the head of your family. Las Vegas mobster Frank Carlotta nearly paid the ultimate price when this rule was broken, thanks to his ruthless boss, Tony Spilotro.
I grew up with this Tony guy. He was a very good friend, and as I said, very good friends are the ones that are going to get you killed. And when he had ordered me to whack some guy out here, I asked him, "Did you get the okay from back home?" And he said, "Yeah," and he promised me he did. Well, he never did get the okay from home, and he got a call from one of the bosses back there, and they said, "What are you guys doing out there?"
Killing someone without authorization from Chicago was breaking the rules. The punishment was death. Tony Spilotro decided to blame his best friend, Frank Carlotta.
He was lying. He was taking the weight off himself, because he knew that if he didn't, instead he readily ordered me to do these things, that they would whack him in the head. So he shifted everything over to me. That was my best friend. We shined shoes together when we were 12, 13 years old. So all my life. He's the guy that actually was the guy that told me, when I get to be a big man, you're my right-hand man. And I was. But that's the same guy that was gonna sell me out to save his ass and get me whacked.
It wasn't long before Tony Spilotro and his mobster brother received deadly punishment at the hands of the mob.
Believe it or not, I felt a little bad for him. Because they were both beaten to death. They weren't shot, they weren't strangled, they weren't knifed. They were physically punched to death or beaten with bats to death, however, and each one was to watch one die, So, I felt bad. There were two brothers at the same time. I grew up with the guy. Even though the guy tried to kill me, I still felt bad.
For all American mafiosi, the rules of the commission were a fact of life and death.
You really never know who to trust. I don't care how close you are with him, if you grew up with him or what. If that's going to be the one that's going to kill you, usually it's your best friend. You do worry about it because, nobody wants to die, and you just have to be a little one step ahead. Well, let me put it like this. Most people grow up with only 4 or 5 friends in their lifetime. One day I made a list, and I think I counted up to 56 early. And some were killed by the police. But the majority of them, like 36 or better, were killed by the outfit, the syndicate.
Carmine Galante didn't care about the commission or its rules. He believed the American mafia was soft and that his connections with the ruthless Sicilians made him invincible. But there was more than one advantage of having an alliance with the old country.
At first, nobody thought much about it. But then the rest of the mafia began to get really nervous because they began to ask themselves, now, why is he bringing in so many of these zips? And everybody put 2 and 2 together. These guys are running heroin. This is a Sicilian connection at work here. We don't need this. For one thing, the organization felt we can't control the zips.
Sicilians made and smuggled in the heroin. By hiring them into his own crew, Galante was making sure he would stay at the heart of the heroin business.
For what he was trying to do with in the heroin business, it would have been, good for him to be aligned with the more Sicilians, the better, because that's where the pipeline came from.
In the late 70s, the Sicilian mafia dominated the heroin trade. On the streets of America, the profits being made were reaching $20 billion a year. Galante was trying to keep the profits to himself. Something had to be done.
He was greedy. He wasn't, the Bonanos may have been involved in this, the profits from this drug trade, but Galante wasn't sharing it even with his own people and the family, because he was, an egomaniac. He wanted to be the boss, and nobody was going to tell him what to do, and he was going to run his family, and he wanted to run the other families too. And during this time, Galante was making deadly enemies. The other bosses didn't like him because of this attitude that he had, that he was the top boss in the city.
Everyone knew on the street that the clouds of war were right there. I mean, if this guy stayed loose, what he was plotting would have definitely caused major, war to happen between the families.
For mob bosses, the Galante problem was growing. Only the commission had the authority to act. Their solution would be violent. Galante had to go. The question was, how would they get past his ruthless Sicilian bodyguards? On July the 12th, 1979, Carmine Galante paid a visit to Joe and Mary's restaurant on Knickerbocker Avenue in Brooklyn. It was one of his favorite haunts. Run by his cousin, he felt safe there. He was joined by his two loyal Sicilian bodyguards.
There's a courtyard that you go into, and is an open-air courtyard. And they were sitting down getting ready to have lunch. And Galante was sitting there, and he had his cigar in his mouth. Three guys pull up outside, jump out of a car. They run in the restaurant and start blasting away. Galante ends up getting shot, falls off his chair, sprawls out on the ground, face up, and he still has his cigar clenched in his mouth. And that's how they got Galante.
This is the famous front page that greeted America the next morning. Galante's meteoric rise to the top had ended in a pool of blood.
Carmine Galante was rubbed out today as he sat in a Brooklyn luncheonette, a gangland execution of a man believed to be the most important organized crime figure in the country.
After the murder, the killers fled the scene. But in an amazing coincidence, one of them walked into a club that was under police surveillance. This incredible footage shows him reporting back to the commission bosses after the successful hit. But the feds were about to get an even bigger surprise.
Well, when the police came on the scene, they had immediately identified Carmine Galante's body. He was an old man, had a cigar stuck in his mouth, totally lifeless. As the police pieced everything together, they were told that two other individuals who were in the backyard with Galante, later identified as his so-called bodyguards, they were the ones who miraculously got out of there without any wounds whatsoever.
Forensics found 5 different caliber slugs in Galante, and there were only 3 gunmen. So that leads you to believe that there were 2 guns someplace else. And the only other 2 guys there were Bonaventure and Amato.
Bonaventure and Amato were the 2 key Sicilians Galante had brought over for his own protection.
The police deduced from what they saw at the scene that Bonaventure and Amato were not there to protect Galante. They were there to ensure that his assassination was carried out without a hitch. The ultimate treachery was performed by his own men. The men who were supposed to protect him from any harm, they were the ones who actually helped carry out the assassination.
The Sicilians had turned on Galante. It seemed his greed had upset others besides the commission.
The Sicilians who had arrived in America in the 60s and 70s, who were helping bring in the heroin from Sicily, wanted full control in their hands. The message was, we are bringing it in, we are going to be involved in the distribution network. Therefore, we want a bigger share in the proceeds. And that was the message of the New Sicilians. We are the ones doing it, we want a bigger share. Not what Galante was doing, keeping most of the share for himself.
Galante's murder made the FBI even more suspicious about the Bonanno family. For the commission to whack a boss meant there were big things going on. 2 young agents, Charlie Rooney and Carmine Russo, were given the job of watching the Bonanno Sicilians.
This is the area where myself and my partner, Charlie Rooney, spent a lot of time conducting surveillance. And we needed to find intelligence that could only be found on the street. And that meant being out here, being the eyes and ears, basically, of the FBI, trying to determine who these Sicilians were and what they were doing.
One Bonanno member, who soon came to their attention, was Sal Catalano, who ran an Italian bakery in Queens. The FBI realized that Catalano was a key figure in the heroin trade. Suspicious packages were constantly being exchanged, probably containing either heroin or money. The FBI decided to play a waiting game in the hope they could break open the whole operation.
One of the things that we in the FBI, and of course all of law enforcement, wanted to know was how were they bringing the heroin into the United States at that time.
Over the next 5 years, Russo and Rooney's surveillance operation evolved into the largest investigation the FBI had ever undertaken. Finally, after recording and translating more than 55,000 wiretaps, the team of 400 agents worked out how the Mafia smuggled heroin into America.
They used their businesses, furniture businesses, construction businesses, marble, things of that nature. In particular, the pizzeria business. They needed tomatoes for the sauce.
The Mafia had taken over pizzerias across the country and given them to immigrant Sicilians to manage. The operation was controlled by Sal Catalano from his bakery in Queens. This footage shows some of the actual restaurants implicated in the Pizza Connection trial. Restaurants just like these were used to distribute heroin around the country. The heroin arrived in the US through all kinds of routes. Their methods were often ingenious. Cases of canned tomatoes or boxes of cheese arrived from Sicily, stuffed with heroin worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But the pizza network was not a retail operation. Mafia dealers never sold the heroin directly on the streets. Instead, the imported narcotics were divided up and sold to smaller street dealers. That way, the bosses stayed well away from the dirty end of the business. The pizza restaurants had another use as well. Catalano and his crew could hide their profits by passing them off as restaurant takings.
Pretty ingenious cover. I mean, you know, who figures a pizza place? You know, you figure you see some guy slinging dough around making a pizza. What's he going to be involved in?
Mafia dealer Henry Hill regularly used pizza restaurants for his drug drop-offs.
It wasn't difficult for me. I used to go to a pizza joint in the shopping center, leave my car there, and take a different car home, you know? And I go back 4 days later, you know, sit there and put the money in the trunk.
The evidence the FBI found led to the very top of the Mafia and all the way back to Sicily.
Salvatore Catalano was aligned with the Corleonesi in Sicily. That's where the power came from. It was Salvatore Riina, the boss of the Corleonesi. Salvatore Catalano came here with a purpose. Purpose was the Sicilian Mafia had a commodity that was being sent to the United States. They needed people here whom they could trust and carry on that activity.
The power of the Corleonesi Mafia and their ruthless boss, Salvatore Riina, stretched all the way to America.
Who knows how long they had been doing this before we stumbled onto them. And we basically stumbled onto them. And I believe what did it for them and for us was the Galante murder. Without that murder, I don't think we would have set our eyes on them at the time that we did.
Meanwhile, FBI agent Joe Pistone still had a problem. How to escape alive from his undercover role inside the Mafia. Despite Galante's murder, Joe Pistone's dangerous undercover operation continued for 2 more years. But in 1981, his mission came to a dramatic climax. The head of Pistone's Mafia crew was a hard man called Sonny Black. Over the years, Black had been impressed with Pistone. Now Sonny decided to honor Pistone by making him a made man, a full member of the Mafia. But there was one big catch. Pistone would have to kill someone.
When Sonny Black gave me the contract to do the hit, I mean, you can't refuse it. You have to take the contract, otherwise you're the next guy that's going to get killed, because you know, that's just part of being a mob guy, a mafia guy, is that because you don't do hits on a fee basis. You just do it because you're part of that crew. I accepted the hit. Luckily, the guy that I had the contract on was on the lam because he knew he was going to get killed. But I went looking for him. I went to Florida, back to New York, and couldn't find him because he was in hiding.
In a twist of fate, Pistone was asked to whack one of the men who had assassinated Carmine Galante. But it was not to be. The FBI could not allow an agent to commit murder. On July the 26th, 1981, Pistone was pulled out. The FBI decided to tell Pistone's mafia contacts that he was an undercover agent. These photographs show FBI agents leaving a Bonanno family hangout. They have just told Lefty Ruggiero that his friend Donnie Brasco was an agent. The consequences of this news for the mafia crew were deadly. In this photo, Sonny Black discusses the FBI's bombshell with his crew. A few days later, he disappeared. The following year, his body was discovered, washed up off Staten Island.
He was in a body bag, and they had chopped off his hands. And that was an indication that he had brought me around to shake hands with mob guys that were of status.
These photos of Lefty were taken just after he found out Pistone was an FBI agent. He knew he was in big trouble. The mafia would never forgive such a mistake. The Bonannos put out a contract on Lefty Ruggiero. But the FBI found out and snatched him into custody before the killers got to him. Pistone gave evidence against Lefty, and he was sentenced to 20 years. He died of cancer on Thanksgiving Day, 1995.
At least Lefty didn't get clipped, you know. He lived his life in jail. He got what he deserved. I mean, I didn't make Lefty a gangster. I didn't make Sonny a gang. I didn't make any of these guys gangsters. They were gangsters before I got there. They were gangsters while I was there, and they were gangsters after I left.
Joe Pistone had survived undercover for 6 years.
But I mean, that's a long time to spend undercover with that, with a crew that's, more than capable of killing you and taking you apart, dumping your body's parts somewhere. And to have those guys trust you to a point, I mean, I never heard an FBI guy coming close to getting made. I mean, they were looking to make him.
Bullshit is his way through it, and then he got addicted to it, and it took the government a lot of years, and I mean, they got a lot of cases out of it, but it almost destroyed his life, and he thought he was a wise guy, and he thought he was an FBI agent.
After being pulled out, Pistone spent the next 5 years testifying against his mafia buddies. Then in 1986, he left the FBI to write a book about his experiences. But his life would never be the same again. Even now, he lives under an assumed name, under constant threat of assassination.
The Mafia put a contract out on me when the operation terminated and I surfaced. My identity showed up. Am I worried about it? I don't think about it every day. Just take precautions and go about living the way I live, and if it happens, it happens, and the best man will win.
Thanks to the efforts of law enforcement agents like Joe Pistone and Carmine Russo, the Pizza Connection investigation seriously weakened the American Mafia. After years of making vast profits from narcotics, it would take much more than that to stop them. No one could have foreseen that in the coming years, the actions of one mafia boss would change everything and bring the American and Sicilian mafia to their knees.